Welcome to the fourth Futures lecture series. It is a hot afternoon. I'm so glad you're all here. I hope you have grabbed a bottle of water out there. My name is Niels Buband, and I'm also happy to welcome you if you're watching this on live stream next door or on a podcast sometime later in cyberspace. I don't know about cyberspace, but I think the buzz in this room is extraordinary. It is the fourth Futures lecture, but I think it's the biggest ever. And it's extraordinary, I think, because we're honored today to be able to welcome an extraordinary guest speaker, Professor Bruno Latour. Before I introduce him, let me say a little bit about the background for the event and about the program tonight. The Futures lecture series was created 2 years ago by the School of Culture and Society at Aarhus University, and its format is fairly simple. Bring in the best and most innovative scholars from the humanities and ask them to answer the biggest questions of all. What kind of world do we live in, and what kind of possible futures are out there for all of us? Finally, add 2 panelists or discussants who will push those questions, and in the end, hopefully, if there is time today too, we will put the questions to you, or rather allow you to put the questions to today's speaker. The aim is also simple, but actually also hard. It is to demonstrate that the time in which the humanities could afford to be passive is over. The world needs the humanities more than ever, but for the humanities to live up to that task, to grasp that possibility, they may have to transform themselves radically. I think no one is more eminently suited for this double task of assertion of relevance on the one hand and of remaking or rethinking than Bruno Latour. For 4 decades, Professor Latour has urged the social and human sciences to rethink themselves, and he's one of the most influential philosophers in the world today. His influence, I think, is due to the fact that he's actually so much more than a philosopher. He's a sociologist of science, an anthropologist, a curator of exhibitions, and an activist. Bruno Latour is professor at Sciences Po, the prestigious Paris Institute for Political Studies, where he's also scientific director of the Media Lab. Professor Latour has held honorary positions in the University of Amsterdam and London School of Economics. And in 2013, he was given the Holberg Prize for Excellence in the Humanities. Each of his more than 24 books has been groundbreaking in its own right, reshaping the way we in the social and human sciences understand and study technology, science, democracy, religion, modernity, the social, politics, earthworms, monkeys, humans, and more. Professor Latour's work is thoroughly innovative, consistently challenging, and frequently, actually, I find at least, witty, in spite of the seriousness of the themes that it addresses. And there's no way in which I could probably introduce you to the nuance and breadth of Professor Latour's work in a short introduction, if ever. So instead, I thought I would tell you a joke. It is a joke that my daughter, who's 11, taught to me, so if you wanted to be kind, you could pretend to find that it's funny. Anyway, here goes. A man walks into a bar. A large frog is attached to his head. It seems to grow from the man's head. "Oh my God," says the bartender. "How did that happen?" "Well," says the frog, "it began with a pain in the ass." It works slightly better in Danish when you say, "in byld i røven." There's a melodicness to "in byld i røven," but a pain in the ass will work as well. A talking frog, a bartender who invokes a god in which he likely does not believe, and the possibility that humans are merely hemorrhoids in the backside of amphibians. I think there is no better way, more appropriate to introduce the philosophy of Professor Latour, and also the theme of his talk tonight. We live, one might say, in a world where frogs have begun to speak to nature. That mute entity of Enlightenment thought has begun unexpectedly and loudly to talk back to us. Rising temperatures, ocean acidification, freak storms, flash floods, unseasonably hot in Denmark and very cold in Paris, invasive species, climbing extinction rates, and climate refugees. Something clearly is being said here, but who speaks and what is being said? How should we reorient our concepts, our thinking, our methods in order to listen to this? Or are we better off doing what we've always done? This latter option, doing what we've always done, is the conventional option of the modern world, the world of realpolitik and real science. And yet, it is becoming harder to ignore the voices for these politics and sciences of the real. Take frogs, for instance. Amphibian populations around the world are plummeting. They are victims of a chytrid fungus carried by the African clawed frog, Sinopus laevis, if there are any biologists in here. The frog became a global species that was able to infect other amphibians because it is used as a pet and in the medical trade, in the medical research trade for pregnancy tests, for instance. The human-caused extinction rates of amphibians that are due to many other reasons than this, but this is part of it, is such that some scientists now worry that the extinction of amphibians might trigger a mass extinction event on a scale that is equivalent to the 5 others that have occurred in the Earth's history in the last 500 million years. I think it is fair to say that humans really are a pain in the ass to frogs, and maybe their extinction will turn out to be a pain for us as well. Professor Latour's work has always taught us to rethink our thinking, to reset it, to listen to frogs and to other non-humans, to include them in our analysis of the present, of politics, and of the future. I think I can promise you that today will be an example of this. It is also, so I gather, a really unconventional presentation today, so I think you really have something to look forward to. The presentation is called Why Gaia is Not the Globe and Why Our Future Depends on Not Confusing the Two. Please help me in giving a warm hand and welcome to Professor Latour.
Thank you very much. I think it's fitting for a friend to be linked to frogs to start with. Although it's, I think, the first time that I was introduced by a talk about hemorrhoid, but you have to learn. My talk is about orientation to the future, or disorientation. The disorientation, which was mentioned before, that is, it's very hot here and very cold in Paris, and we have to move north in order to find this beautiful weather, but also disorientation and reorientation, and that's why I asked to do a little drawing, and maybe you want, because I was told it's more like a seminar thing, a piece of paper, because I might ask you a question and maybe scribbles. So don't hesitate to take a little piece of paper and trying to answer the question which I'm going to put to you. We are going to, in spite of the heat and the size of the audience, trying to make it a more seminar. The first thing I will start in the orientation thing is a very famous text, which I'm sure many of you know, which is Edgar Poe, Maelstrom. And if you remember the story, it's not very far from you, it's in the Lofoten. The fisherman is in the maelstrom, which is a nice metaphor of the situation which was just summarized before. And he is taken by the whirlwind, and he noticed that there are lots of things which are disappearing here, especially his two brothers who are jumped and in the sea and disappear, and that the boat on which he is also disappearing. But then, suddenly, he remains very quiet in spite of a catastrophe in which he is. And it's an interesting part of the novel. Because he realized that it's catastrophic, he is very quiet. And then he noticed something, which is a difference between some type of object which goes straight into the hole and some type of object which, in spite of the fact that they are in the whirlwind, actually float. And that's especially true of a barrel. I ask to be able to write on the blackboard, but my writing is awful, so don't try to read what I've written. The key point is that he stick to the barrel and he emerged unscathed from the maelstrom in spite of the fact that the boat, his two brothers, and everything else has been sort of sucked by the very powerful maelstrom. So what I'm interested in doing with you today is sort of a detection. So we are in a catastrophe, but we are very quiet, and we try to detect what the difference between those things which sink in and those things that float. So it's a slight difference. We have to do a sort of sorting mechanism and a trial so that we can detect what is disappearing very quickly and what can float. This is what we cannot expect for more. As Anna Singh has said in his marvelous book on the mushroom and the end of the world, we live in the ruin, so don't expect to escape from the maelstrom, but try to get yourself tied and attached to what is not actually going to be sucked by the thing. Okay? So this is my little introduction. Now things become simple and then more complicated. The simple thing is, how do we detect? What is the test which allows us to make the difference between what is sucked in and what is floating around? We have one orientation mechanism which we have been using for many years, which is the idea that there is something which we call a modernizing front or frontier, which is the one I've studied for about 40 years, which behind it is basically archaism, and in front of it is something which is precisely the title of your lecture series, The Future, and something which, toward which we are supposed to move on, right? And the powerful feature of this modernizing front is that if you are here, you can be easily accused of sticking to the old ways, of being archaic, or being passé, etc., etc. We have dozens of these little words which allows us to sort of organize and sort of make a gradient between those who want to go back here and those who are moving here. Okay? The modernizing front. Now, it exists actually, as many political scientists have shown, in two different gradients. One of them is about the mores, or the ways of life, and the other is about the economy. So I'm sure people in this room, we divided because some of us are clearly enthusiastic about moving in the future in the mores, called liberalization of all the shackles from the past, and in economy as well, which is embracing the globalization as much as we can. Some people, of course, are critical of both, and they would much prefer not to go toward the liberalization of the ways of life and to be as protected as possible against the danger of globalization. And I think many of us, we hesitate, and sometimes we are fairly happy to embrace liberalization of the mores, but somewhat suspicious of embracing the globalization of the economy. And you could also be the opposite, which is usually more on the many parties on the sort of central middle right, which is that they embrace fairly well a large, enthusiastic appeal for globalization of the economy, but when it comes to ways of life, sexual habits and so on, and family, they prefer to stick to the older system. Okay? Now, this is not what I'm interested in, because this difference is actually not that big. There is one really big feature, which is the one that organizes this direction. And here we forget about the fact that it's different when it's more an economy. You see anything? Yeah, it's nice. Now, we need to name those two attractors. One attractor, I would call it the globe. In the discussion, we might discuss, is it Is the name a good name or not? It doesn't matter too much here. This we would call, and it's again a strange and too much a simple word, let's say the land of old, the one out of which we were moved by the movement of modernization. The word doesn't matter too much because we are going to try to see if we cannot think differently. But yet, what is clear is that the modernizing front is still in our head. So that it's still organized the way we share and we distribute what is progressive or regressive. So it's still our compass, if you want. It's the way we organize ourselves and the way we look at the future as something which is organized along this line here. Now, all of that works fairly nicely, but on one condition is that the globe is still the attractive horizon toward which we are actually moving. Now, what happens when this horizon of the globe is actually suddenly missing? And the way it is missed, there are many ways to show it, but a very striking ways to understand that it misses, of course, what happened with the ecological mutation right now, as if people were suddenly realizing that the modernizing horizon toward which they were all sort of moving without being too sure it's good or bad was actually suddenly missing. For one very simple reason, which was demonstrated beautifully in Paris in December, which is that when you count all the contribution of the different countries which were asked to give their vision of the future at the COP21 in Paris in December, suddenly when you sum it, you realize that there is someone speaking here, or is it translated? No, it's not translated. Is there someone translating? No, because there's a background, someone is talking to me, but I don't understand what he says, so it complicates my lecture a little bit. What is interesting is that when people brought together all these plans for 2030 and 2050 at the COP, and suddenly people clearly realized that there was no planet could absorb all those projections of the globe. So the globe is much too big, so to speak. Not the real globe, but the mental globe of the modernizing horizon is much too big to be suddenly squeezed inside the planet. And what happens when the globe is actually suddenly something people realize there is no way toward it? This is what's happening, and I think that's where we are all here somewhat in a state of angst, because there is a sort of huge whirling movement which could be called the global backlash, which we have not only in every country of Europe, in every single country of Europe, but throughout the world, in the US, in Indonesia, everywhere, which is that suddenly people realizing that the globe is not there are shifting their passion, interest, future horizon to something which look slightly like the end of old, but it's actually, of course, a neo-land of old. That is the land, basically, of made-up identity and invented tradition. I would be very happy to say that this happens only in France with the National Front, only in Poland with the new election, only in Italy with Padania, only in America with Monsieur Trump, but it also exists here in Denmark, this utmost civilized, open, and democratic nation. So everywhere we feel the whirling movement of entire nation, like England, like France, Poland, Holland, etc., which are moving there, not to the old land, of course, because this land, of course, is a reinvention, but which is certainly completely different from the globe. And we are all lost, because we also lost our ways of organizing position as progressive or regressive. I know political scientists say this is populism, this is reactionary, this is a return of a sort of neo-fascist movement, etc. But I think that all of those labels are actually dangerous because they think as something which is the return of something old. Whereas I think it's better and more interesting to study them as something quite new. First time in the history, short history of globalization, where people realize that the globe will never be there. So we are somewhat, it's a metaphor of course, in the situation of people who would be in a plane, if you want, and they are being traveling in this plane. I'm not going to draw the plane. We are moving toward the globalizing airport, and then the pilot says, ladies and gentlemen, this is the pilot speaking. I'm really sorry, but the globe has disappeared. So we are not going to land on it. And then the plane sort of shift back and toward where it was coming from. And then the pilot, this is your pilot speaking again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to say that this one here is actually a complete ruin, and it doesn't exist anymore. Because the neo-land to which we want to go back as protecting ourselves through identity politics is a completely impossible thing after what has been done with the globalization. Okay? So you are in the this is actually a nice metaphor. It's a big plane. I'm the pilot. And I'm saying, well, I'm sorry, but the place where you wanted to go and the place where you were maybe sort of tempted to go back have disappeared. Then, what do? Well, you look out of the windows of the plane to try to see where would you land. Where is the alternative to land? And that's what I'm interested in trying to draw. Where is, oh, here is it. So see, all of that was the simple part. Because I think, even though I'm not a political scientist, everybody would agree that understanding very, very carefully what it is that we are tempted by in this moment where all the people simultaneously, globally, exactly in the same terms, are turning their attention to identity politics. And of course, the most interesting and telling aspect is the Brexit, which is quite extraordinary in this case, because England was the country of globalization. It invented it. It invented the world market, and it's the one which is shrinking back to a small, quite uninteresting and rainy island, which no one had expected. So now we have to reorient ourselves a little bit, and that's where this is why I needed. We sort of thought that the globe as a horizon was defined by cartography. We have a cartographic definition of the globe. So what I'd like to contrast, and that's the title of my talk, and the abstract, is a globe in the cartographic definition, which is, in fact, and here there are many people from the STS community, they would recognize the situation, a largely social and elaborated construction from the 17th century through basically cartography. And I will symbolize just by the sort of cartographic grid that we know very well. And of course, we were very happy when we added to it the blue planet from the NASA, etc. We all know this history of the feeling of the globe. The problem with this idea of a globe is that it's actually viewed from a position which is from nowhere. I mean, you could say, and STS people will tell you what exactly instrument in astronomy and physics allow you to see the Earth as a globe, but for most of us, it's actually a position which is not situated, as Donna Haraway would say. It's not situated knowledge. It's a sort of idea of what you would see if you were in a place from nowhere. And in addition, you compare this globe with a whole series of other globes, the other planets, etc., and you dive all of those things in something which we know as the universe or nature. This is basically what has been sort of captured or kidnapped by the notion of globalization, of second nature. This is first nature, second nature meaning the economy. So globalization is a sort of fusion of one definition of the globe coming from cartography, physics, astronomy, with a completely different but visually and symbolically similar image, which is, of course, fused in the word globalization. Okay? Now, the strange thing I'm interested in discussing with you, and of course, this is why I'm very pleased to be with my friend from STS and with Isabel Stengers and Anna to discuss afterward, is that the place where we do reside here has none of the character of a globe. So, and that's why I need you to take a piece of paper and begin to write down the differences between these two sorts of figure. Because this other figure, and here I'm going to draw very bad drawing, not only, which is true, because I'm a terrible draftsman, but also because we, strangely enough, have no imaginary, no visual imaginary for what we reside in. And this is why I opened an exhibition in Karlsruhe in May called Reset Modernity, just how do you visualize where we are, which should be a simple question. Philosophers had imagined that we knew where we reside by saying, the scientific worldview is one thing, but the lived world is something else. So we had an idea through phenomenology, through many philosophical movements, through the humanities, through poetry, that we could actually situate ourselves as a lived world completely different from the scientific world. This was, so to speak, the 20th century solution to the problem we are dealing today. But of course, now with the question of the ecological mutation of the Anthropocene, it doesn't work. We don't want to be in a lived world. We want the world, not the lived world. Or we want the world of life, not the world, the lived world, which will let the other world, the one known by scientists, to this view from nowhere. Because now we can't just see the world from nowhere. We need to situate ourselves. So my clumsy, we are here. It's not so nice, I agree. It is a small, thin varnish, or a skin, if you wish. Tiny, tiny skin, a few kilometers here, a few kilometers there, which some scientists call critical zone, to describe that it's where we live and everything else live. It's not seen from above, it's not seen from a position of anywhere, it's actually always seen, and here you see how terrible I am, by scientists and activists, politicians, citizens, laterally. It's seen laterally, not from above. We live, I mean, look at the gardens here, you don't see it from above, you see it de biais, if I can say that. Which is not at all the same imagination as when you suppose that you are here and then you look at the cartography from above and you see it. And it's not the same thing as saying, I'm a lived word and I live a science. The word of reality to the scientist. Okay? So one of the important things here, and I've shown that in the Gifford lectures, is that here we have something which could call, and Husserl would also call Galileo, which is the idea that you can see the globe from elsewhere, from the universe. And here you have something which I associate with a character which for me is exactly as important, with Lovelock. That is completely different definition, where there is something highly special to the Earth, which is why he calls it, actually, why not giving it its name, Gaia. By the way, if you know the invention of the word Gaia, while Lovelock was trying to find a name. His friend, the novelist, the authors, suggested gyre, which is a nice term, which is actually linked to the maelstrom argument. And Lovelock said, gyre? No, said something. He said, no, Gaia. And Gaia has stayed. But gyre is also a good word. So, yeah, because it's not a globe. It's a thin pellicule of slightly fragile and robust set of intertwined life form, which is very different from the vision you could have of life if you have this vision, and which is just as scientific, which is, of course, the reason why in STS we are working on this. So here, basically, you could say this is the realm of what would be called, if a little pedantic French philosopher is allowed to use a bit of Latin, which I know you should not do anymore, it's res extensa, which is this idea that there is an isomorphic space in which planets and everything else is situated. Here it's completely different. There are things in which space is situated. Anna Tsing has a very nice expression for that. It's that she said this space here is not scalable. It's not made to be scalable. This word is entirely made to be scalable. So what I think would be useful to orient ourselves is to have a different name for this one and for this one. Not the difference between the real scientific word and the lived word of subjectivity. Two entirely objective definitions, but pointing to different set of entities and a different set of lived form, so to speak. So I propose a little operation of excision, if you want, which is, we call that the universe, and this we would call, because critical zone is a bit strange, so we could reuse the old word of physis. Physis is the word which was used by the Greek to talk, and many, the whole medieval tradition, to talk about everything which is actually in movement, generation, and death, as well as movement. And as you know, and Isabel Stengers has written extensively on that, when Galileo decided to get and to invent this position, which would be basically the Galilean universe, the idea was to cut out of all the events of the physis, only one of them, which was movement and space. But at the time of the Anthropocene, we cannot limit this definition because we live in it. So I propose, this is a proposition, that we cut out in the universe this little, very thin, very special, very fragile, very lively, very folded part of the universe, physis. Now, one last point, because before I get to the next part, and which, of course, would be of interest to STS people here, on the universe, which is everything but physis, there is not much, there is a sort of epistemological peace, if you want. Because the debate, the fights between the different versions of science and the general and the rest of the public is not actually so tense. You might have different view of the moon, different view of the cosmos, different view of the inside of the earth, but really, you know nothing, right? And there is a privilege, and a legitimate privilege of a scientist on that part, because the instrument and the way and the distance with the thing they know is actually in their hands. So you can learn from them, you can ignore what they do, but basically the discussion would be difficult. At least there would be a great asymmetry. And if you say, I think the Big Bang is not that at all, they would say, sorry, but can you get out of my laboratory or something? Now, this is not the case with here. Everything which is there is not the realm of epistemological piece. It is the thing we love to study in STS, which is the situation of epistemological warfare. And of course, one of them, very well known by all of you, is the climate question. Okay, so if you agree with my two first points, one of them is that we were oriented by the modernist sort of line or vector, and that now the two ends of these vectors have vanished, and that we have to be disoriented. And the second point, that we might be interested in a definition not of a lived word, but of actually getting into an objective, quotation mark, scientific, quotation mark, shared, quotation mark, disputed, etc., which we would call physis, or to give it its name, Gaia, then things become politically interesting. And here you need to take your little piece of paper, because we now have to work out our test. So far, the difficulty of orienting ourselves was due that every single time someone had an hesitation about going this way, he or she was accused of being reactionary, archaic, passé, or looking for a nostalgic view of the past. And I'm sorry to say we are in a Protestant country, so I can ask you to make a little consciousness, getting into your own soul, and ask you to remember last time, maybe 5 minutes ago, or 2 days ago, or 2 years ago, when you told of a position that it was archaic, or not modern, or etc., and that you actually preemptively condemn a position because it was not oriented in this direction. And again, it can be on economy, but it can be on ways of life, etc. And I'm not going to ask you to say out loud what and when you did this the last time. Okay? But if we were in the seminar, it would be fun to do. So what I'm proposing now is to make a third attractor to try if we could escape the preemptive strike, which has, and I don't have time to develop this point, which has moralized politics as soon as the notion of modernization became entrenched, which is, of course, depends on which century you consider. That is there a way to be able to sort out position about anything from agriculture, food, transportation, morals, etc., without immediately be brought back to this situation here? So imagine yourself, you are now here. You are in the middle, not of two attractors, which we could still call the land, in its two definitions, that is what Husserl will call the archi soil. It is a really old aborigines soil, if you want, and the neo soil. And then you have the globe. Okay. Now, we know the globe has this very strange character. The first one is, I said it before, is that it's enormously too big to be shrunk into the planet. But as all the people who study economics know very well, it has the secondary contradictory feature to be completely provincial. What we call by the global is that means that we obey a very, very tiny numbers of people compared to those who are actually composing the Earth. And I'm not talking only about humans here. So to be globalized means really provincialized by very few and small numbers of people. So this is why the global never works. It's too big to be shrunk in the planet, and it's too small to be actually representative of where we are. So what would happen if we were trying to sort out position? Are they progressive or regressive? Not according to this modernizing front going this way, but if they were stepping, looking to this different land, soil, I don't know how to call it, Gaia, Earth, Gaia, whatever. So you see the exercise. The exercise is to take the thing we shared, the one we value. We know, and we have many encounters when we are sort of shocked to hear when we criticize the globalization. Yes, 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 but you want to go back to, and usually 5 minutes later, it's the cave where you have this very strange system of light, which is chandelle. How do you say chandelle in English? Comment tu dis? Candle. You all have that. If you have slightest interest in ecology and if you make a slightest critique of anything about globalization, immediately you are told, you want to go back to the candle in the cave. I mean, or the equivalent of that. And if you want to do that on science, 5 minutes later you are, yes, but Galileo, etc. I mean, this is the sort of argument that you... And they make sense, this argument, because the orientation movement that we have in our disposition is actually not much more than that. If it's not going there, then it's going there. I mean, there's no alternative. We are extraordinarily poor in inventing futures. And every time we invent future, we have to map them here. And the most extraordinary element of that is the complete impossibility of the ecological movement and parties to escape the trap of being neither left nor right. If you begin to say, no, I'm not left or right, they say, then you are from the right. Because they are projecting this question here. But ecological movement and parties, even though they have mostly disappeared, at least in France, and all of the mass of people doing activism everywhere in the world, they are not looking at this line. They are, with all the mess, difficulty, confusion, looking to a different territories. Which is, of course, if you do a little bit of geometry here, it looks like the middle of this place, but it's not. It's another place. It's another attractor. And this is why I'm interested in many different things, which is to try to define the land, the soil, the earth, on which actually we would need, in order to be able to sort the different values which were entirely invested in these two attractors, each of them has now disappeared. If not, it's very clear that we will all move to the identity politics, in spite of what we say. We can claim it's, look at the complete impossibility of Democrat and Republican in the US to just stop Trump. I mean, they can't argue with people who say, so panicked by the globalization, whatever we do, we want to be back to the land of old. Give us our identity. Everything we would be able to sacrifice. We want to be, it's like a sort of going to the boat when the thing sinks. So, the solution, if you follow me, is to try to get, okay, let's collectively try to draw the figure and this element here. Okay? And I have a few minutes left to do this exercise, and I need again my blackboard and my excellent diagram. I'm known for my bad diagrams. Doesn't matter because I like them. So, we have 3 attractors and not 2. So we call it the land. It's very bad, but you understand, these are concepts. So we have a globe, which is 2 qualities of being too big and too small. And let's say we have the Earth, but of course, we should not confuse it with the globe. Now, what are the characteristics that we could actually begin to distribute if we were doing this sort of selective test? And here we need, I'm going to do it, but this is a seminar, so you have to do it as well with your own value, and we will do it in the discussion, because my obsession might not be your obsession. And I hope not, actually. So, for instance, one of the things here, which is an extremely important value, is the sort of protection. And we know from workers' dispute during the last 2 centuries that every time, and this is Polanyi's as well as Marx and everybody else, as soon as workers or laborers talk about protection, they were immediately told that this was something they should abandon for the global. So the movement was, on the contrary, no protection. Okay? Which is already very complicated value, because most of the movement toward what I call the great global backlash to identity requires protection for a good reason, which is that there's no life in the globe. The globe brings no protection, and that cannot be a value either, and we should be able to express this. Protection is necessary without being immediately shift back to the archaic resisting definition of what protection is. So we need to invent a definition of protection as a necessary value, which would be happy to put somewhere here. So the Earth, whatever we do on Earth, and not only us, but even the frogs, and even the French frogs, have to be protected. I'm not talking about protecting of species, you understand? This is a concept of values. When someone tells us, you are archaic, regressive, traditionalist who want protection, we should not be preemptively accused of immediately shifting along the line I drew here backward. We should say, no, hey, wait a minute. We want to go here. We want to be able to define something which we share with other species, which is something around the notion to be elaborated of protection. It won't be the same past. It won't be an archaic definition of protection. But we have to recognize, and this is why I drew my little diagram, that we have to be able to talk with the people who are attracted by this one, that we share something. Yes, we do share something about the value of being protected. I'm not talking about flexi security. Everybody talk. In France, we are all saying we should. If only we were Dane. And of course, with the sun now, everyone is going to say, let's move from France to have flexi security and sun. Second point, I have a very long list, but I'm sure you can increase it. The other thing is, of course, that this has some characteristic of being local. And we have been obsessed during the time of the modernist parenthesis by the distinction between universal, local. So if someone says, I've found a new way to farm in ways which is not the destruction of the environment, which doesn't obey what Anna Tsing called the Plantaciocene model of agricultural production, immediately people say, oh, it's local. It's just local. And then you are sent again along this line and basically having to prove that this is scalable. So, of course, every time someone does anything, it's criticized as being just local in this thing. So there is something, and it's a very interesting gradient here, which is to say, no, it should actually be something, and here we don't have a word, because if I say global, I know the word glocal has been tried, but here I want to use Haraway's word, which is the word wordlet. Wordling. Yes. Well, it's not your language either, so you won't bother. So this is a very interesting work. And of course, it's the case in many of the people who are working in this direction. Because Worldling has some of the characteristic of the globe. It sense that it's actually sharing interest with many species. It's not just located in one little canton of the world like it would be here, but it's not a universal element. And it's not, the word is exactly that, and this is why Anna's work is so important. It's not scalable. It has a different definition of scale. And it's something which, with my students, some of them here, we are trying to work a lot, because it's very complicated to cartography a non-scalable space. Okay? So this is another features which would be interesting to describe. Now, I'm not sure that I should go on, because I'd like you to work, actually, now. One of them, which is important for me now, which is linked to yes, sorry, this is very important. This was lived and real, or symbolic if you want, doesn't matter. This was divided, will and lived. So this is a great moment of bifurcation between objective quality and subjective quality. When we were modern, we could always say of anyone criticizing modernism, either you're silly and it's just a fancy of your imagination, or very politely say, oh, it's interesting, let's do some ethnography about it. So the two versions was always in sort of sense, or you all know if you do Chinese Tai Chi, or if you eat only whole rice or something like that, or if you go to your diviner, you always try to do this little job. Except now it's not possible. So now on Gaia, not on the universe, but on the physis, on this little skin there, you have something which is difficult to describe, which is realistic. I don't know how even to do it. Realistic, objective, let's try that, multiplicity. Which means that the power of dismissing a position because you use this real lived actually is losing ground. And to reground, because this is a word which I like, which Alexandra was here told me to use, is regrounding is actually the word which would use here. Okay? And we can go on, and I hope we will do it in the discussion. So, conclusion. Now, I needed actually a much bigger thing, because I'm worried that I erase these things, and then you forget about my point, and then you will say, where are we going? Because it's a lecture about the future. And I erase it, so it doesn't work. I put it here, the third attractor. I put it here because it has a strange, and of course I'm playing with geometry here and mythology as well, but it has the nice features that it's down. Here, during the modernist history, we were actually looking for décollage and degrounding. And here we are regrounding. But of course, we don't want to land here, even though the whole of Europe and most of the world is actually trying to land here. Because if you followed me, they know the globe is not actually something which has any existence. All STS people knew that from the beginning. You don't live in res extensa. No scientists live in res extensa. But we had this idea that the utopia of going to the globe was still feasible. Now no one believes that. I mean, no one. At least everyone sensed that this massive promise which had been done to all of us, that we could modernize the planet will not do for lack of a planet, right? But where is this planet? So strangely, the people who are suddenly hearing, even though no one actually articulated that clearly, everyone who hears that the globe is not the direction where we were going, suddenly are asking this strange question, where is the planet? And we have a sort of uncertainty, is it here or is it here? And it's not the same figure, it's not the same science, or at least it's not the same set of science, or the same spirit of science, and it's certainly not the same politics. Because those who are interested in going there will have somehow to define so we are, I think, most of us is somewhere here, lots of quotation mark, this is us. Sorry, I need to draw that well because this is us. We are all lost here. And it's unfair to give a lecture to orient everybody to say we are lost. Well, we are not lost because now we have 3 different things where we look and we try out and select what is progressive and what is regressive. But now progressive means going this way. And regressive might be 2 different things, going this way or going this way. And alliances are possible. See, the great danger, and here I'm talking in a discipline I don't know, which is political science, is that the great danger is that if you accuse all those movements to be simply reactionary, populist, and neo-fascist, you won't talk to them. You would just, and it's very striking, is that every single time people in the New York Times or elsewhere say Trump lied, people say, it's completely out of the question. This is not a question of lying. It's not a question of having a political position. It's not a question of platform. It's a question of what in French we say, sauf qui peut. Sauf qui peut. Well, I don't know the word in English. I mean, it means this is gone. You are not telling us. Let's get there. Yes, I know I'm finished. So the reason why I put it here is because it's below. We have to learn to land. And of course, it's very complicated to land because we are still trying to get into this horizon. And there are many different figures for that. But the one I was interested in introducing to you was the maelstrom. That 2 of my students from SPIP are actually doing a play on that maelstrom. Because it's amazing that the guy who has taken a maelstrom is actually quite enough. And suddenly very alert and detect the difference between what sinks and what floats. I hope I've shown some of the things that float. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. Yes, please take a seat.
I'm going to take my...
And please take off your coat. The future is warm. This has been wonderful, and I'm going to do what in stand-up comedy is called paddling now for a couple of minutes while the stage is being rearranged. I think this gives a lot of opportunity now to actually get to what this whole lecture series was about, namely the futures. I love that your statement that we are so poor at identifying or thinking of alternative futures. And this is where we are now in a moment where the future is no longer inscribed into this space-time of cartography and chronology where things go from the archaic to the modern, but there's another opportunity. Gaia is, I think you've called it the true other, our true other, this thing that we cannot know. And the part of the reason why we cannot know this other is because the we that seeks to know it is a we in search of itself, I think you've called it, that the we that we used to imagine, the globe and the land through was a we that was delusioned, I suppose one could call it, had a false consciousness of oppositions between them and us, between human and non-human. And what happens if one tears that apart? I think so. The relationship between, I think, the remaking of the humanities as a way of thinking differently about the world is actually also a different form of future thinking, I suppose. I thought we could call it the third attractor lecture series from here on. I don't know what you want to, if that's a good idea. Futures will do for the moment. I'm so happy to be able to perhaps continue what you've called the work of diplomacy here, and I'm pleased that to have two eminent diplomats here on stage with me. One is Isabel Stengers, Professor Isabel Stengers, and Professor Andreas Röpsdorf. They will be what one might call in charge of affairs. I think the French is chargé d'affaires, diplomats who will take the first step in trying to do that work of diplomacy, which is avoiding destruction at the hands of imagined differences. And I think you've given us some of the problems in imagined differences before. How to avoid war, I suppose, is the work of diplomacy. And if I can introduce you to them, none of them need introduction for different reasons, but Isabel Stengers, or Isabel Stengers, depending on where you come from, is professor at the Department of Philosophy and Ethics at the Université Libre in Brussels. She has a background in chemistry and has for decades worked to promote a politically critical science of critical zones, I suppose one could call them, a kind of science that transcends the borders of natural and human sciences. Another science, she has insisted for a long time, is possible. And this insistence goes way back to 1984, when she co-wrote the book Order Out of Chaos with Nobel Prize recipient Ilya Prigozhin. Isabel Stengers is also an honorary doctor of Aarhus University from 2012, I believe. I think.
Yes.
Oh, well, and she gave the keynote, a really interesting keynote lecture at the Danish STS conference earlier today. And I'm so grateful that DAST wants to lend Isabel Stengers to us, and that you are able to be here today in a busy schedule of conferencing. Andreas Röpsdorf holds a joint professorship in the faculty with the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Health at Aarhus University. He has a double degree, very appropriate for this talk, in anthropology and in biology, and is director of the Interacting Minds Center, a research institute that tries to combine natural research, natural science experimentation, but also other forms of experimentation with human science critical reflection. He has been awarded several honors, including just last year, the Carlsberg Foundation Research Award. He studied nationalism in Lithuania, halibuts in Greenland, those flatfish, and a science lab in London. And he's beginning a new project on play, suitably funded by Lego. He's also followed the work of Bruno Latour longer than anyone I know. And to start off the debate, and I really hope there will be time, and I know there will. We have an hour left, so there will be time for questions also from the floor in about half an hour or so, if you agree. And can I start with you, Andreas? You have called Bruno Latour the James Bond of science studies. Maybe that's a good place to start.
I think it's probably not just the James Bond of science studies. Remember what James Bond is. It's a 007, right? There is a license to do something that many other people are doing. It's kind of going in and putting small devices in that just explodes the world so that it looks really differently from before. I think this was how I first experienced reading Latour many years ago, and I thought this was also what we saw today. But I think there is kind of a democratic sense to it, so it's not just the kind of going in himself and blowing up stuff. I think where it has been really important is there is also like a licensing to others as well. At least that's how we usually teach it, that kind of in the hands of, or with the blessings of Latour, we all become 00 agents who can go out and kind of map out territories in ways that it could not be done beforehand. And that kind of feeling of, where should we look for agency? It can be in people, it can be in doorstoppers, it can be in things, it can be in animals, has opened up a really important territory. So my first question to you, Bruno Latour, would be, is it so that what we really need in the world today are more special agents rather than diplomats or generals?
I'm lost with your metaphor of a special agent. I have to say. I was already lost with the hemorrhoid, and now I'm completely lost.
I should have said toad. I know.
Who is sending the agent? I mean, what's the authority? I'm not sure I understood the question actually.
I guess the question is that these days we don't really know who is sending the agent, but there seems to be agents fighting for some causes. It used to be, the country or the globalization, but what we need today is that agents fighting for the earth instead.
Well, I think the military metaphor of spying doesn't work very well in this situation. What I'm interested in, for example, take one of the, we don't have the image anymore, but if we go on sorting out this quasi-dialectical, the notion of agency was limited in the middle period, which is the modernist things, where agency was supposed to be for humans. I mean, as everyone in the social sciences, but if you were adding agency to non-humans in chemistry or in biology, you immediately shifted to a sort of para-scientific or pre-scientific sort of illusion. And now I think it's very interesting to work with scientists and activists who are multiplying agencies in ways where immediately they are not split into agency as representation and agency as objective, so to speak. So the word agency has actually shifted in part for my work, but not only for the work of anthropologists to describe also ontological features of the word. And I think that's what changed. So I've lost the metaphor of 007, which never struck me as a very intelligent political mind, but a good killer. But I don't think I sympathize with that. But what is really interesting is that agency can now describe in a very different ways. And we were discussing with you about witchcraft, a subject of great interest to Isabelle. On Earth, that is on Gaia, on this little ring of critical zone, it's much more difficult now to dismiss preemptively someone by saying it just subjectively in your head. So now the multiple ontology, so to speak, could become acceptable, and that's where diplomacy counts. So the metaphor of diplomacy is strong. Mm-hmm. The metaphor of spying, not so. I mean, it's more difficult for me to respond to the greatness of spy. Besides, James Bond is 007 is Brit, and they are going to disappear anyway because they go to the Brexit. So no one will pay any attention to them anymore. There will be no further 009 film. That would be my view.
Isabelle, what is your most burning question to Latour?
Okay, well, I love to criticize or say not enough, but today it's more difficult than usual. I think there has been a jump in concreteness, today. It's an event, to my mind. So I will try anyway. It seems to me that, well, I saw the shade of what could be a danger. It is not in your talk, but in the way it could be relayed. And we are living in a dangerous world where very often the stronger relaying agency is the worse. We take the more dangerous part and even activate danger where it was not meant to be dangerous. And it is this difference between the made-up land, pseudo-identities, and the earthly ones of the third pole. It could be used in terms of judgment. This is made up identities. So go back to. So it seems to me that what we deal with some activists, and here I would speak about the witches from whom I learned so much. I would call them resurgent identity. It's not back to the past. It is experimenting with and trying to go on and to reactivate things of the past which have been destroyed. So it's more, I would say, reinvention in a completely different context. And I think there must be a lot of precaution in front of the idea of made-up identity. It's what I find very, very compulsive. In contrast, is this idea I would call of generativity of physis. You may make the difference between made-up identities protecting against outside danger and resurgent identity through the kind of generativity with which they experiment. So that's a proposition, and an addition would be maybe what is more disturbing with saying goodbye to scalability. It should be warranted to work at any scale and with any people, anonymous people, any teacher. We have to give the rule of teaching which are good for any teacher in front of any children and all that, is that it means saying goodbye to scalability means a measure of accepting the risk and trusting the capacity of learning locally. And it means that there is no ready-made solution which would evacuate the question. And I think that saying goodbye to scalability and all the warrants that it will work at any scale, it's a version of what Haraway tells us about learning to stay with the trouble. And I think that those earthly this early earthly third pole is meant to have us staying with the trouble, even if we are grasping the barrel. The story is not over. Well, he succeeds since he wrote the story, but I'm not sure we will be able to write the story, but it's not interesting.
Do you want to respond?
No, can I ask a question?
Yeah, why not?
On the first point, I agree entirely, of course. On the second point, I want to understand, because the test which I try to make with these three things is always to remember what's lost and what's gained every time you say. So I didn't understand what would be lost by losing scalability.
But in fact, I think that there may be a third version of the idea of protection. When public order is concerned, or when what is rational is concerned, it usually means we must produce programs which will be protected against the stupidity, against the self-centeredness of people. Normal people are not to be trusted. They will abuse. So we must produce things which are protected against that. And the measure of trust is we have to trust people, but what are the conditions which produce both the trust and all that? But the point is that we have to leave away the protection of scalability. It works whatever the people.
On the first point, I think it's very important that one way of getting some of the poison, so to speak, of the ecology is precisely that the third attractor is entirely reinvented as well. So of course it's not moving, because that would be a re-archaization. It's not moving from a sort of, and it's very clear when you study the politics of Park, And you must have the same here, where in France the park actually made a lot of humans as well. The national park, only one of them has no human in it. So of course the wilderness, the whole question of wilderness, which is a cliché of history of science as well as STS, it would share a need. That's where we need a sort of shibboleth to describe the well-made identity from the sort of badly made identity. We knew that, but I think it complicates and opens up the question when you have three ways of making this identity. So it's not the same if you invent a saucisson, which would be a local saucisson, which would be exactly the same as the other saucisson, except it would be a local saucisson. It's a big issue in France with the what is called the protected name of things. And I think you have also some of those here in Denmark, some of those disputes. So every single of these reattachment to this free pole has a different definition of what it is to invent identity. And we should try to fine-tune to be able to differentiate. Because every day, every time we read the paper, we do actually this selection between what seems to go this way, or this way. The problem is that it's very difficult to have a political position which is arguable if you don't define the land, the soil on which this, the horizon on which this is going. And the ecologists did as if we already knew something about the Earth. And what is so striking in the work of the new natural historian, as you would say, and the group of Anna would say, is that we suddenly realize how different the Earth is from a globe. And it's not even seen. We try with some of our students and in the exhibition in Karlsruhe to make the distinction between 2D and 3D. So one of the work of art is by Pierre Huyghe, who is a French artist, and it says it's called Giverny translated, and it is actually an impressionist painting because it took the soil from Giverny of Monet, except it's an aquarium with lots of fish in it that you see, but sometimes you see nothing. So it's actually built a 3D view of a fragile, sometimes invisible ecosystem. And then you measure the distance between Impressionism and 2016 art form. And it's one of its many ways in which you can begin to feel that landing down is not at all the same thing as the sort of, for example, the vanguard history of art.
Yes, and it's something which I think is so very important because the modernization funds very often produce the idea that, well, some things are destroyed, but what has been destroyed can be recomposed. If you can do it, you can make it, unmake it, and all that. And there is different, what Deleuze calls, Gilles Deleuze, the philosopher, calls différence de nature between destroying, disentangling, and reproducing new entanglement, regenerating. I think one you can destroy without even knowing it. Galileo, when he disentangled one motion, the one from which he would be able to learn and to tell, from the others, he had no impression of destroying anything. He was just purifying, analyzing. But in order to regenerate or reactivate entanglements and generativity coming from entanglement, you have to practice art of paying attention, noticing, not imposing your goodwill, not trusting goodwill, negotiating with not submissive force, being ready with surprise, learning. And it's something which to me is very important. It's that this term learning, learning with, learning from, and all that, it's one of the words the less used in philosophy. Only Leibniz spoke about learning, but...
Who did?
Leibniz.
Leibniz.
But Kant, you don't learn anything, everything is your head. And all that. Sartre, you don't learn. No, learning is absent.
So I thought maybe if we go with this very beautiful metaphor of the third attractor, the Earth, as a non-scalable, a realistic objective multiplicity. Now, what I would like to hear your both opinion on is, now, what do we do with time, or what do we do with the past in terms of its agency? Because we can say from the global perspective, or from the local perspective, from the land, the past is everything. And from the global perspective, traditionally, the past is absolutely nothing. But it seems that neither everything nor nothing is really capturing the importance of pasts for experimenting with the kind of presence that we live in the current moment. So how do we deal then with the past from this third attractor, the Earth, this non-scalable, realistic, objective multiplicity?
Well, we now have three past. The past, the past of a modernist future, which has absolutely no relation whatsoever with the first past. Every anthropologist knows that. But when you try to imagine what were the people who were not modern, they were, of course, not archaic. I mean, this is a cliché of anthropology since at least Lévi-Strauss. And the new past, I don't know if it's better, would be something where precisely there is no past, in the sense that simultaneously you would have, for example, if you take agriculture now, people who are disputing the Dane model of agriculture in France, they would say, if we resist the gigantic farm with 1,000 pigs, we are not going to the other past, archaizing farm. We are inventing a non-scalable, I mean literally a non-scalable, non-plantatiocene type of things, and we of course invent lots of things about Brittany and invented tradition about Brittany, because this is what happened in Brittany, and we try to find a way, but precisely the way was not found, because it's a very clear case. The only thing that the French agriculture ministries told these guys who were on strike was, do like the Danes and modernize yourself, because now, as I said, the Dane is sort of the hill, the city on the hill now, the new city on the hill. And this is completely a poison for the people, because what do you do when you said, have farms of 1,000, and every single other way is archaized. So it's very important to be able to say, I mean, if there's one notion which is infected or inflected by the modernizing front, is the word past. So, and it's immediately when I say that, immediately I hear, you want to go back to the past. You are reactionary. Which, of course, I am a reactionary. But the question is to what you react and where you move. And as long as you have this only vector, a reactionary is always easy to detect, because a reactionary is going there. But what if you are a reactionary going there? A reactionary and an activist begin to look different. And that's what I'm trying to articulate. And of course, agriculture is an ideal case, because it's where everybody is. I was on a farm recently, and there are people who were talking about a postmodern hedge. There was the old hedge which had been cut, then there was the postmodern hedge, a high-tech hedge with dozens of new things in it. But I like to hear how Isabel will answer the...
Well, I will give... time is a very complicated thing, so I will protect myself behind a philosopher, which is my... the one who is more important for me, who is Whitehead. For Whitehead, the past is what we have to inherit, one way or another. Whatever we do in the present is inheriting the past, but what matters, what is to be thought, is how we inherit it. There is no conformity, or there is no freedom from the manner in which we inherit is invention. Whatever the past, we inherit it through invention. But how do we honor the invention? Or do we present it as a disqualification or as a conformity? This is a question of cultivating the idea of inheriting the past with the question.
But innovation and cultivation, would that be the same? Because it seems that the innovation will immediately pull us towards this, upper attractor. So is it a cultivation rather than innovation? Is that the metaphor?
Let's say that for Whitehead, whatever we do, we innovate one way or another, but we can innovate through disqualifying. This is modern, this is rupture, we have nothing to learn from the past, we are out of it, yes, thank you. But we can honor the question of how to inherit it. Open the question and honor it, give it importance. And this would be cultivation.
My chief job today is to dumb everything down a little bit, and if I could do that by asking you to be a little bit more concrete about what Gaia is, because if the whole problem is that we're strung out between these infernal alternatives between the globe and a land that is full of problems too, politically and analytically and existentially, then what Gaia is seems to me to be really important. And you've been multiplying words in order to describe it, Gaia and Ge, etc. I was wondering is there any way to be a little bit more concrete? And just as a warm-up, maybe, you mentioned in one of your texts that the best example you could think of for Gaia comes out of a Lars von Trier movie, Melancholia, where I realize there are two globes, so it's a problem. But there's the planet of Melancholia that swallows up the Earth in that last ending scene. The movie has been described both as an artsy film about the apocalypse, but it's also been described as a psychological drama about depression. It seems to me that Gaia is the possibility of thinking Gaia is both a result of a history of ecological disaster, but also, is it also a zeitgeist? Is there a zeitgeist? Is there like a moment in which it is now possible to think Gaia that was not possible in the 80s when globalization seemed to work?
I mean, this wouldn't require a long time, and Isabel has as much as to say about it. My version of Gaia is that it's sort of layers and layers and layers of different things, starting with the name, suggested to if you call it Earth system science, you have a completely different set of association. If you talk it like the Earth, you have another one. If you talk of Gaia as a new age goddess, you still have another one. So I think we have to accept the idea that Gaia is all of these things, layered, and it gives another entry. I give you a simple answer, is that now I'm in the habit, when I talk to geochemists, geopoliticians, etc., to ask, are you a Gaia chemist, or a Gaia grapher, or a Gaia politician, etc.? And the single simple difference between these two words, which are exactly the same in Greek, makes a nice shift, because everything which was stabilized and simplified in geography, geology, etc., which means the background and foreground, the human in the foreground on the background, is perturbated. So whatever Gaia is, it's a redistribution of the agencies of foreground, background. And this is why I did a play on Gaia, because precisely this is ideal for a play. I mean, this is also a bit of a play, but it was the most complicated play. Because it's exactly the sort of thing you can approach from mythology, from science, from Earth system science, etc., etc. But it direct attention. So, of course, the fact that it's new and arrives is probably part of the zeitgeist, but we should not forget that this is from the 60s. So it is a sort of belated zeitgeist. And the way I use it is it's up for grabs. I mean, Gaia is up for grabs. But it's not nature. And that's an essential point. And it's not creation. which is another very important problem for theology.
Maybe this is a good time to bring
What
in
is
the
strange,
audience.
just to add, is that no nature, but physics was nature for
Yeah,
the Greek.
it was a long time.
Before Galileo kidnapped one kind of motion and forget about the rest.
And what
And-
Isabel says before is, I think, very important, is that what Galileo did, you cannot redo it by adding the lived word on top of Galileo. And if there is a zeitgeist, from my understanding of what the science, the natural science are doing now, is exactly that. But it's not adding life on the movement in a sort of superficial sort of remediation.
Yes.
There is no way to remediate. But there is a new entanglement, and this is why the word of Gaia I like most is multifolded, which is, by the way, an old term of mythology. The multifolded Gaia is actually a Greek epithet of his name.
And if I may add, just I think what we have to get out also is analytics view holism, because Gaia is not a figure of
A whole.
holism, because there is no unifying point of view, even internal. Multifolded means there is indeed no good point of view from which to understand even internal, not from nowhere, but
Gaia is not scalable.
yes, not scalable, neither the whole, but at each scale it's complicated.
I think we should take a question from the floor, if there is one.
Hello? Okay. Thank you, all of you. I have a very quick question. I wonder if the point of view that the four of you have been discussing isn't quite Eurocentric or perhaps European and North American centric. And I wonder if how these dichotomies you're discussing and what they mean to us would look differently from a Chinese or Indian or Arab point of view, especially as they've become much more wealthy and much more politically powerful in one lifetime, while a lot of the anxieties behind what you're discussing is the lack of a comparative wealth and political power for Europeans and North Americans. Thank you.
Well, my talk is unabashedly Eurocentric, because that's where the prime comes from. So, and then it has been extended, of course, but the difficulty of meeting other collectives when you are a modernist is the prime nowadays. And that's why I call the exhibition in Karlsruhe Reset Modernity, using the metaphor of reset, which has its own difficulty. So it is it's very important to be Eurocentric, so that you can actually extract the poison, which makes absolutely impossible to consider positively and in terms of multiple agency the alternative worlds which are inhabited. Also for another reason, which is that which is very beautifully illustrated in a book by a young anthropologist called Nastasia Martin, who studied a nation in east north of Alaska, which is called Les âmes sauvages. I hope it will be translated in English. It's very, for me, in the same league as Anna Tsing's book, because it's exactly the prime of the difficulty of the ecologist, of a missionary, of the administrators, to understand anything about what it is to live in the ruins of Occidentalization. And it's exactly the prime why I think the whole project, my project on inquiry into mode of existence is, again, completely Eurocentric. Because that's where the difficulty of just registering the other way of inhabit the world never cut ice, because constantly they are pushed to the first attractor. All those nice way of living in the past, all this, etc. So the bon sauvage argument is built in that, and as long as we don't say, okay, we share the same situation, of course, as you said, very light, much more dramatically, you and us, but we now have the same whirlwind, the same maelstrom under our feet. And we can enter into a collaboration in anthropology, and I think you would agree with that, which would be unthinkable before. I mean, you lose your ground, we are beginning to lose our ground as well. How do you do? How do you do is not the same thing as before. How do you do with Dr. Livingstone, I presume?
But
now it would be, you lose ground, we are losing ground as well. And how do we cope? So coping, to use again Anna's argument about ruins, is I think something which establish, and I think precisely the dispute about is it Eurocentric or not is completely understandable by people. I mean, it's time to put some order in your own house. And that's my project in anthropology of the modern.
And Gaia is also the place to do that. I think you have collaborated with Vives de Castro and Deborah.
Yes, but they all agree with this gentleman that Gaia is a typically Eurocentric figure. And I think it's true. But that's precisely why I find it interesting. It's the peace gesture. If we arrive and say, we live in Gaia, we have one little chance of being understood by people who don't live in Gaia because they have no idea about nature and all these things and they have ignored it altogether, like Philippe Descola and so on. But at least we can begin. If we tell them, you live on Earth, on the globe, and we are now sunk into the same globalization movement, they say, well, you don't understand us. I mean, I don't know if it answers, but this is the link of
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture and discussion. I would like to insist, perhaps, reiterate the question of concreteness. I think there were a lot of very exciting and interesting concepts, some of which we know, some of which we might not be very familiar with. But, you know, entanglement, multiplicity of agency, generativity, those are things that have been around a while. And so I would very much like to ask you, maybe the three panelists, to briefly try to connect, try to commit yourself to maybe a practice. And as the field of the exercise, I would want to know more about the question of digital culture and especially the question of the digital humanities. So what can you think of as concrete practices, maybe of research, maybe of teaching, for us that you think at the moment, right here and now, would help us to multiply agencies, would help us to entangle, disentangle, complicate agencies? I would like you to fill those very abstract and, dare I say, academic cliches with some concreteness.
Well, I'd like to know what is on your own page. Did you do my little exercise of selecting the three things that on attractor 1, attractor 2, and attractor 3? Okay, go ahead. I think you'd like to have the answer yourself, so I think it's better you to say.
One, of course, is precisely the question of digital culture.
Say, what was your answer?
What?
What was your answer to that?
My answer is, I mean, the question is, how do we place ourselves in terms of digital culture, in terms of digital humanities? Because from the perspective of people in academia, it, of course, is on the one hand, it's a threat. It's a tool of disciplining academia and disciplining the humanities. On the other hand, it might very well have opportunities which I'm perhaps not aware of. So I think rather than playing the game of insisting, and I understand that, there's a very good purpose for it, but insisting, so to speak, on remaining abstract, I would like to throw also the question back at you and say, where as an activist, in which kind of farm in Brittany have you encountered practices which you think at the moment in that concrete situation had what one might also have agonistic potential, or were constellations that at the moment, of course, allowed for another place for Gaia to emerge, however briefly?
Thank you.
I think you should answer those. They are to the whole panel. My connection with digital humanity is well known, I think, and I've done a lot of it, so I don't think I need to answer that.
Can I try to answer for you, or at least see if you wanted to go that way? That it seems to me that analysis is your form of practice. That you have this wonderful where you say that it's time to invert the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, where once upon a time with Marx, we should stop interpreting the world and start changing it. It seems to me that you are saying we should stop trying to change the world and start interpreting it in a particular way that for that reason your diagramming, your cartooning becomes a form of practice, actually a form of politics. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I think I would be undiplomatic and say the accusation of abstraction is usually by people who have in their head even more simplified and abstract concept. So the accusation against academic talk on that score, don't cut any ice with me, because it's exactly the opposite, is that we, in this situation, which is witnessing half of the world going back to an identity politics, are, I think, largely limited by the numbers of concepts we can simultaneously entertain. And the fact of being able to entertain only two poles doesn't seem to be very good. So a work by academic, for academic, using not abstraction but speculative concept and figure is our duty. And if people find that abstract, so bad for them. I don't give a damn. It was not a more diplomatic, it was a diplomatic thing. But sometimes diplomacy say, I won't discuss that silly question.
Well, of course, I mean, committing to a practice, being a researcher means, I guess, doing research. But what strikes to me here is that, in a way, we have been exploring also metaphors of not just being in the world, but also of seeing the world. The primary ones being either there is a view from the outside, as in globalization, or as a view from within, as in the local perspective. And it seems that maybe what the Earth perspective is about, or what a lot of research, what a lot of practices should be about now, is trying to understand what does it mean to take a perspective from between, whatever that is. In other words, if you look at the Earth, it's really interesting grabbing a piece of Earth or a hand of Earth in your hands. It's kind of the betweenness of it. It's the relations, it's the potentials for perspectives that seems to define that kind of materiality. And maybe these are some of the research practices that one could be looking at. Not so much either the phenomenological from within or the classical scientific from the outside, but trying to develop kind of a language for what is it like to take a perspective from between. And how that translates to digital humanities, I have no clue at all.
But I think it's mostly a question of description. We are very bad at describing the situation that these gentlemen were rightly requesting. I mean, it's very striking to see a whole industry of agriculture completely paralyzed by this idea that there is only one vector, which is modernization, and every time sort of bio things, bio-agricultures come in, to be cornered into the local, the small, the non-scalable, and the archaic, and trying to fight out of that. So, of course, there are many very important things to do practically, but it's the role of intellectual, especially French intellectual, which are known for their abstraction, to the small layer of things. It's small, I mean, it's very small, very impalpable, which is what, when we are paralyzed by poisonous concept. And modernization is a poisonous concept, and it's the duty of those who have been infected to try to extract it, so that other concrete, although I don't know what it means, but concrete situations are actually give a sort of a leeway. Because if you paralyze them by saying modernize your farm and go from 100 pigs to 1,000, where do you lead these people? And every single word is actually leading in, and people should never criticize concepts as abstract because they play such an important role.
There was a debate in Denmark a couple of weeks ago. The National Ethics Committee, yes, there is such a thing in this country, suggested that that the state should impose taxes on meat as a way of reducing methane emissions. And the counter-argument, I remember, was that if you raise taxes on meat, making it more expensive to buy it, that would mean that the poor section of the population would not be able to eat meat. So the argument that defeated, reducing methane was that we actually, it's a social justice issue. We should not, do this because it would be socially unjust. And it strikes me that that is the kind of, I think you call them infernal alternatives, Isabel, that they're the possibility of either continuing to emit methane into the atmosphere or social unrest because people don't eat meat. That seems to be of that same kind of logic of if you're not over here, you're back here.
Right.
But I think there is an argument here that, should we not only describe it, should we not also do something? What would be should we eat more meat or less?
No, I think that just as William James, I think that ideas, abstraction do matter. You have just to take care of your abstractions. And William James' question, which is not an answerable question, but a matter of concern, was when you add such ideas, do you elevate the value of the real, or do you diminish it? Mm-hmm. So it's not a question you can answer because you cannot measure the value and all that, but it is a concern, which is a bit like Leibniz. Tell why here, dic curic. Don't give general reasons, but in this situation, what do you add or what do you subtract? And it seems to me that, I don't know, but it seems to me that the point is also to take into account what is already going on, since it was, I don't know a lot about digital humanities. What I know is that all those activist research about producing in another way food and all that would not have been possible without the web. It is there that they acquire their know-how, discuss, produce, and meet between them and learn from the failure and the attempt before. So I think that if there is a digital humanities, it's going on. And it's going on through the hands of amateur, connoisseurship, learning to do together. To reclaim together things which have been forgotten and which come back new.
Should we try a question over here? Sorry.
I'm sorry. Well, actually, he was ahead of me, I think. But okay, but just very quickly, I was getting a little bit confused about the globalization issue. I've been going back a lot lately to Teilhard de Chardin and the concept of the noosphere. And if I look at lots of the rhetoric now about the Internet of Things and smart cities, it is a globalizing rhetoric, but it's a globalizing rhetoric which has I think a great richness to it. And you seem to, Bruno especially, you were polarizing, the kind of global is bad, back to the land is bad, Gaia is good. But for me, there is a globalization, around that sort of vision, which is actually a rich and interesting one, which is giving agency, which is really dealing with distributed agencies in ways that active network theory has been talking about for the longest time.
Oh, yes. The third attractor has cities in it. It's not a countryside, I should have said. And big cities, and cities which are actually actively selected by thousands and thousands of architects, activists, and critique of what the future of a city will be. But so, of course, you're perfectly right. But we have exactly the same question in architecture. And actually, I'm discussing next week with Philippe Ram, who is one of the most original redistributor of features of a city, of the future of a city. And we could have talked about that in a more concrete term. So in spite of what I said, and that's the danger of using the word Gaia, it's not a nice sort of countryside. It is a highly active with lots of web. The problem is to select inside the many hyped about the future of digital cities, how you select those three set of values which could help you to decide where you want to live. And there are many cities, connected, hyped city where I don't want to live. So the selection mechanism is exactly the same. But you're right to thank you for allowing me to say that Gaia is not a countryside. Yes, it's made of big cities, but these cities have to be selected detail by detail. And what is so interesting in discussing with architects is that it's precisely the selection is extremely fine. It goes in every single details of what the city is about. And it's even its extension, the way it's built. I mean, architect is in a way the concrete discipline of what I was telling before. Also, for one simple reason is that cities are one of the most active politically in the climate discussion. And the network of city does a lot of interesting innovation as well.
Mm. Should we take another one from over this side?
This arrow you drew with the globe on one side and the land on the other, and the choice of going one way or the other. I'm just wondering, trying for myself to figure out how to deal with this, because I've been rather interested in Jeffrey Herf's book about reactionary modernism. And if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first reference to globalism is Adolf Hitler. And of course, we all know Charlie Chaplin's Dance with the Globe. And at the same time, they were also the great people for land. And since we've been talking about Danish agricultural policy, our present government is the Farmers' Party, and they are going in for intelligent agriculture, which means agribusiness globalized. And at the same time, they're the most reactionary party.
Right.
Take the silver from the refugees, you know. So it seems to me that the global, in a way, the local is a creature of the global,
right,
and vice versa. So somehow or other, this new way of thinking has to get out of that somehow.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I call the third attractor.
Yes.
But you did more than anyone else to show that exactly that. The local is the local of the global.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is a polarity which is born in the same way. The question is to shift the compass in the other way requires not to reuse the local and the global. And this is why I think it was useful for us to do this little exercise. I say the local of the third category has nothing to do with the local of the third. And it's not a dialectic mechanism. So, and the case you mentioned is really interesting because in history, political history, agriculture has been used massively by a reactionary party, and especially in France, of course. So, yes, the difficulty is to, again, select. And Jeff's question was, how do you select in the hype about the city? And here's how to select in the reactionary themselves. They themselves have to be sort of selected layers by layers. But to be selecting, you need a selecting mechanism. You need a titration of some sort, a compass, and that's what I was trying to do. Mm. If not, you're always held up because people will say we are for the future of agriculture and agriculture raisonnée, which is one of the oxymoron we use in France often. We are, oh yes, oh great, agriculture. Global raisonnée agriculture, that's fabulous.
I have a little ethnographic observation if you want it. It's, when I read We've Never Been Modern, you know, from '93, it seemed, to me at least, that modernity, as you described it there, was never ending. It may be that we moderns were systematically misunderstanding ourselves, but it was a system that seemed to cope pretty well with its own contradictions and internal inconsistencies. It seems that in your later work, modernity is already, it's kind of already tilted. There's a, modernity is no longer what it used to be, you know, or what it never was. There's a kind of a, that the possibility of a third attractor is kind of in the wobbliness of the whole axis there. You've drawn it kind of as a slanty thing.
It's amusing you say that because in the ZKM show we have asked territorial agency, or a group of architects, to bring in what we call the Museum of Oil. And it's made of gigantic maps of land grab of oil industry in 5 different countries. But it's really big and very precise. But they tilted it by 15 degrees. So when you are looking, when you are visiting this part of the shore, you immediately imagine that whole thing is going to fall on. And it's called the Museum of Oil because it's supposed to be what would be in the future parents bringing their kids looking at our period as a very strange and silly period. But of course, you don't know where it is in the future. Is it in the future, or is it actually the future will be the same?
Right.
So it's one of these things. The gestures you did is exactly this sort of mixture of figure, art form, and concept, which is my ways of moving in this zeitgeist. And that's why exhibition is so magnificent as a media form.
Can we take another question from Peter, perhaps? Ulrich up here. Peter has.
Yes. Thank you, and thank you for a very stimulating talk. I have a kind of a comment and a question. The thing is, of course, this whole idea of the archaic and the future and this kind of modernization idea. Would you say also, I mean, viewed from a point of view of situatedness, well, we all impose archaism and futures all the time. So it's not really like it becomes substantiated as a very particular event in any case. So we all kind of, although, I mean, you are just to leave this kind of model, it seems like to be a very universal model anyway, but not universal in the sense that it's one we share because we always kind of make our own kind of archaism and futures. So I mean, for me, for instance, I would consider Trump to be a very archaic figure, right? Although for others he might be a futurist. But that's kind of a way of maybe questioning some of the ideas of the model in that sense. And then secondly, and that's my question, is wouldn't you say that the problem really is that the idea of the attractor, that maybe the problem is that Gaia isn't able to be an attractor, that is in fact is the very problem, that Gaia doesn't seem to gather us or to summon us to the task at hand. So I mean, to stay with your thinking about the collective in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting, well, first of the commentary, because I think, on the contrary, everything is contemporary. And I think I learned that from anthropologists, that there is no archaic people, but there is no archaic reactionary either. They are always reinventing. And we all remember the mistake which was made in the 1930 when we said this is the archaic coming back. No, it was completely new, and it was very strong. So we should not say Trump. I think it would be a mistake to say Trump. Trump is contemporary and inventive, and it's not something, a resurgence of the past. It's unfortunately something which is neo-invented just as much as the activist world in which we need to live if we want to survive. Now, on the unattractiveness of Gaia, I think this is the key issue, which is, and I have many ways to enter into it, but the one I did it in the Gifford and now in Facing Gaia is the theological origin of that. Why is it that for people who have been in the tradition of Christianity and we say the Western, this indifference to whatever could be called the old, natural world, and there is a series of theological arguments which could be made about that. So it's not. But one of them, which I think is, I sort of alluded to in nature, in this lecture, is that it is linked, I think, to this idea that whenever we talk about Gaia, it's about the lived world. And we have not been able to reabsorb as much of the sciences of Gaia. And the mistake on Lovelock for me is really interesting. As soon as he uttered this argument about the connectedness, but not the holistic, but the entanglement of the life form, it was immediately shifted to a very traditional definition of one organism and a sort of traditional neo-mixtures of things. I mean, horrible view really. So, and that's also what happened to the ecology movement. My question is why it is the same as yours, and I have no answer to that. Why is it that what we live in, it's as if we were not on Earth. We modern are not on Earth. So this is why the news coming to us about climate, soil, fish, etc., well, yeah, it's interesting. But it doesn't concern us because we are not on Earth. And and that's, this gentleman say I was abstract, but we are all more abstract. Because being abstract means we are not of this world. And there are a lot of theological arguments, complex, and I have no time to get into it. My impression of a perfect quietism with which we hear about all this news about ecology is that we are not of this world. It doesn't concern us. We are somewhere else. We are in another place. That's the only explanation I have. It's not a good one. And that's why it's so difficult to re-land, to re-ground. Where would we be if we were re-ground? We have no experience. You cannot re-ground into res extensa, which is supposedly the reductionist view that scientists give us, which is not true, of course. But where would you be if you were in the res extensa? You would be in the complete utopia, an idealist version of matter. So the difficulty of being materialist is, I think, the key thing. And here I should cite, because I have not talked about it, the Pope Francis encyclical. Because the originality of this encyclic is precisely to say, we ground. You Christian, we ground, not look here, look down. And the looking down, with this very important link between poverty, inequality, and ecology, was, in my view, the first really efficient gesture by an authority about what it would mean to reground. But apart from that, I never heard anyone saying this concern. No, it's not doesn't concern. It's about nature. Mm-hmm. No one lives in nature. The moon is in nature. The sun is in nature, not us. So what happens on nature doesn't concern us. It's as simple as that.
There is an entire discussion about the resurgence of religion in contemporary thinking and time that we do not have time for. In fact, we're out of time. So all of you who have questions, I'm sorry, we'll have to end here in hopefully a not too depressing place. I would like you to put your hands together for Isabel Stengers, for Andreas Röpstorff, and in particular for Bruno Latour. Here, Hans. I still there. And every cloud has a silver lining. It's been too hot today. I'm so sorry. I hate people who say that when the weather is warm, it's global warming. But I nevertheless have something here that is perhaps a sign.
I knew you were doing this.
A sign of things to come.
I knew you were doing this. Yes.
Denmark is growing wine at the northern limits of possibility.
I don't want it.
Oh, you should have it.
I don't want even to hear about it.
Because Denmark is the new France. It's the new Bourgogne. And I've given you here, it's won many prizes. And also for you. And typically of Danish products, it has a map of Denmark on the front, just so that you're not, in doubt about where it's from. Thank you very much.
This is the most depressing gift I ever get.
There is actually wine from France, I think, out there if you want a glass to cool down after this hot afternoon. Thank you so much for coming.